You're listening to the Penteract Poetry Podcast, hosted by Anthony Etherin.
Hello, welcome to episode 3 of the Penteract Poetry Podcast. My guest this time is Mary Francis, a collage artist, a poet, and author of the Penteract Press book Sea Pictures. I spoke with Mary a few weeks ago about word games, poetry on Twitter, and finding landscapes in old stones. I began by asking what first led her to poetry and the visual arts.
I guess I got into poetry through a real enjoyment and freedom of words, I think, that came from my family. So partly we were a library family and would go and get books from the library. And I learned to read very, very early by my parents reading to me and following the words with their finger. So just having sat and had the same books read and reread to me over time, favourites, I realised when I went to school at 4 that I could already read. And I hadn't realised I'd been learning to read by that look of the word as the finger went along the page. So that was a kind of a gift, I think. But there were 2 books of poetry in the house. One was my father's, that was Shakespeare's complete works, including the sonnets, which he read. And he read speeches or sonnets to me sometimes. As far as I know, he'd never seen a performance of Shakespeare, and I don't know where he had got interested in Shakespeare, to be honest. But it was a precious book in the house, this very special, lovely gold edges to the paper book. And he was happy for me to rummage through it. So I read stuff before I understood the words at all or the phrases or knew anything about it. I was exposed to a lot of interesting words. So that was, I guess, part of it. And my mum had Palgrave's Golden Treasury, which she'd had since school. And she knew some of those poems by heart. And I began to read and learn those fairly young, really, while I was still in primary school. So things like The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, but The Lady of Shalott, Kubla Khan, these poems which were beautiful, romantic words, it seemed to me, but also, I guess they had an eeriness about them, the ones I liked. There's something very mysterious about them. So they were very alluring to me, I think, as I was growing up. When I said at the beginning about words, there was a culture, I guess, of wordplay, which was a family and cultural thing. It was partly my grandparents, who had a South London vernacular and a bit of a Cockney connection on my mum's side. So rhymes, puns, spoonerisms, those kinds of things. They loved tongue twisters. Talking nonsense talk was something that I was surrounded by when I was little. So if there were a family event like Christmas and so on, people would have a party piece that they would do. And it could be a joke or an old music hall song, but it could be that they could quote a couple of verses of Hiawatha. So there was just this freedom with words that you could use them in all kinds of odd ways, but also no reverence for what was like a classic text. So I will cut up anything. I think I've always had that sense of language is there to play with, and you can be irreverent with it and not be afraid of it. So that was the inheritance of words, I think, and poetry. I still talk to my mum occasionally, and there's a little bit of rhyming slang in there. We don't even think about it. That's like childhood talk. Art-wise or image-wise, 2 things would be significant, I guess. And one would be my grandfather, again, encouraging me to make a scrapbook. So he was a French polisher. He polished wood for billiard tables, and that was somewhere near Victoria. And so he cycled into the city to work every day and cycled home. And sometimes he found these used ledgers outside office buildings. So these are massive, massive, heavy books filled with copperplate accounts and leather bindings and marbled end papers. They were beautiful things. And he would bring them home on his bike and we would have these books to use as scrapbooks because they were free paper and beautiful. So he made me a kind of glue, which was a bit of his carpentry glue, and flour and water, so this funny porridgey paste, and birthday cards and bits of newspaper and just stuff that you'd have in the house. I could cut those up. He bought me little blunt scissors. I would only have been 4 or 5. And I would paste them and stick them together and stick things on a page. And of course, there'd be all these gaps between things where you could still see figures and odd letters of the copperplate writing coming through. So messing with stuff was a huge part of my childhood, making images and putting words together. And I think that probably also helped me learn to read as well, because I cut out words from birthday cards and stuck them onto. I wish I had them now, because that would be a fantastic thing to see. So there was that freedom with images, I guess. But also I fell in love with a particular set of paintings. And I think I would have been 8 or 9. I may have been taken to galleries before, but I remember them only being like churches, maybe religious paintings and war paintings and stuffy places I was glad to get out of. But there was a museum called the Commonwealth Institute in London, which is where the design centre is now. I used to go there with my brother, and there were installations there from all the Commonwealth countries. It was more like an expo in a way than a museum. It was the flora and fauna of the country and the art and crafts and so on. And I liked the museum for its space and colour. But I went upstairs one day where they had a gallery, and there was an exhibition of Whistler's Nocturnes. So I was probably 8 or 9 years old, and I just stood and looked at these pictures and felt as if I were there, that I knew that I could almost smell the river, and that I knew those places. And I don't know how long I was in there, a long time for a little girl, I'm sure. And at some point, the museum attendant tapped me on the shoulder and told me it was 5 o'clock or whatever, and they were going to close. And a few weeks later, when we went there again, I literally ran up the stairs to that gallery to see those pictures. They weren't there, of course. It was, as I remember, sports photos. And I asked the attendant, where are the paintings? And he explained to me that they'd gone, and he told me about touring exhibitions, and that this was the exhibition now. And I said, well, when are they coming back? And he said they wouldn't be. And I just stood there and cried. I would never see these things again. So it was a kind of falling in love with art at that point, I think. Yeah. So
3 episodes into this podcast, it's already becoming a theme, but there are 2 ways people approach poetry. You either want to say something and then find the way to do it, or you just go straight into the words and see what's there and see what you can discover. So it's quite clear that that second way is your way.
Yes, definitely. Found materials. I think this is an accurate memory. I haven't thought about this for quite a long time. I think the first ever poem I wrote, I was in secondary school by then. We were invited to write a poem. And I would have been 12, I think, probably the second year. I can't remember the teacher's name. I wish I could, because I think this is a story of a very intuitively fine teacher. But she'd read a poem of Tom Gunn. And that was interesting in itself, because I could tell at that age that she thought she was reading something very youthful to us. And I was thinking, that sounds like an older person's voice. But I was 12, so it was. It was a kind of an interesting difference. And she invited us to write a poem with the title The Generation Gap, as it used to be talked about then. And she asked us to think of a scenario where the generation gap came to our minds, and then to write a poem about it. And slowly I saw every other person pick up their pen and start writing. And I had an image in mind, not an experience, but something I'd seen rather than something that happened. But I just couldn't think how you would write a poem. I knew poems and I loved poems by then, but no idea how to write a poem. And she could obviously see I had no pen in my hand, and she came over and she asked me, what had I thought of? What I had thought of was I'd seen an exhibition of art by very young artists, very modern abstract art for that time for me to be exposed to. And it was against a wall of an old church, a really old, very ornate and traditional, elaborate church. And I thought that juxtaposition would be a really interesting thing to write a poem about. But I said to her, I don't know how I would write a poem. So she asked me why I liked the art. And I said things about vivid colours and that they were a bit like bad dreams and I remember saying those things because she then said to me, oh, well, when you start your poem, make sure there's something about vivid dreams or bad dreams in it. And then she sort of turned back and said, oh, and gargoyles. Off she went.
Of course.
And it is interesting because I do remember the sort of click, like, oh, I picked up my pen. This was a challenge. This was something interesting to do now. Okay, I'm writing about that thing, and I'm going to use these words somewhere, and then I could write it. So I still never write with a blank sheet of paper. And I have to have some material that I know I'm working with.
Yeah. I mean, the found poetry or found art aspect of your work is what I first noticed. In fact, I think I probably first noticed your work definitely on Twitter, and it was probably one of your striking photographs of old stones.
Yeah.
When did that start for you?
Well, that would be about 10 years ago, and that's when I first started. That's when I got my first camera of my life. So I'm a collage artist, really. So I have always worked with found materials, though I would sometimes paint and draw on top of found stuff. And I walk a lot, and I am very attracted to colours and surfaces and textures. And it just occurred to me that maybe if I got a little camera and captured some of those things, I could use them as bases for collage. I could collage on top of them, and that would be an interesting thing to do. So I bought a little camera, so it's the same one I've got now, a little compact camera. I chose it because it just fits in the palm of my hand, so I can walk around not appearing to have a camera, which felt important to me. And I started to take pictures, and that's probably when I joined Twitter was the first time I showed anyone the photographs as photographs. So what I'd been using those images for was to print them off on inkjet paper so that I could cut them or tear them and then combine them with other things like cut up text or marks made on top of them as collages. But I noticed on Twitter people share a lot of photographs. So I thought, well, I wonder if the actual photos on their own, if people might like them, or I'll share them and see what happens. And all the time I was sharing those images on Twitter, I had a little secret account on my desktop here, secret folder, which I called Imaginary Landscapes. And the reason I didn't show them to anyone is because I didn't think people would see them. Occasionally I would be walking with someone and I would just take a little snap of something and they'd say, what was that you took a picture of on that curbstone? And I'd show them and say, do you know where it joins the road there, that looks a little bit like going into a forest? And I would get a sort of a look, an indescribable look, but it was always the same look. Even though sometimes when I got home and cropped it to the bit that I noticed, they would say, oh, what's that? Where was that? And it was the thing I showed them. But I didn't think people would see them. And it was maybe a couple of years ago, I guess. I think it was near Christmas. I'd had some mulled wine or something. And I thought, I'll just put a little composite picture of some of those little tiny landscapes on Twitter. And then everybody was writing, saying, what is this? What are these? Are these really stones? And I thought, oh, they can see them. That was just a revelation.
But they can see them because you've cropped them, because you've presented them the right way.
Yeah.
You obviously have a great eye for spotting these things without that aid of the frame.
Yeah, I can see them. Often I can't get close enough to them to just take the little fragment that I want as a photograph. Also, it's such a basic camera, it's limited what it can do. But it's important to me, strangely, although people call me a photographer now, but it's quite important to me that in a way I'm not really a photographer, or in the sense of like the professional photographers who do so much work to create their photograph. And it's technically enormously skillful what they do. So compared with them, I'm at the snappy snaps end of photography, and it's actually quite an important part of the project because it is a project to me, which is that these things are there and I haven't made them, and I'm not showing an artistic impression of them either, or my preferred enhanced version of them. The camera is still on its default settings, its factory settings. I don't even know what the settings are. So there we are. It looks to me like what I saw. So that's good enough. But I want to show them in the form that if you just walk down that alley, you'll see that too. So I'm finding things which I think are, they feel important to me in that they are not what you notice when you're in a city or a town. They're urban pictures. So they're not pictures of the countryside, though often they appear as if they are. And people do sometimes ask me, what woods are these, or what coastline is that? Which is nice that they see it as a photograph and not quite yet as a stone sometimes. But it's important to me to kind of reconstrue the rather dystopian feel of a lot of our urban spaces just now. So I will walk around. I'm quite drawn to those places now, to walk around and see, can I find any magic there? So I think that maybe I do have an eye for it, because the art in it is more the eye than any skill of photography. Or I'm creating very little, but maybe just have a knack of finding things.
Yeah, there's a pure found poetry to it.
Mm.
So obviously then, if you just using this old camera, there's no color manipulation. There's cropping. Is there also rotation to help find the right?
Yes, sometimes when I catch sight of something, it's actually upside down. I mean, I do look quite closely at stuff. I walk a lot, and I walk on my own a lot, and I'm always attracted to things that are an odd texture or a little color or a strange pattern or something. So yes, quite a few of the things that I show you, I first see them upside down. I see a sky with a sort of sea above it or a mountain above it. So, and I know that if it's reversed, it will become a place. It's interesting to think about it looking like a place. In a way, they are places. Though I called them originally imaginary landscapes, they're not imaginary. They are there, and they almost appear like a kind of portal. You do walk into them. And I think that is why people have enjoyed them, and I'm really delighted at the way people have really responded to them, but also the way that people claim them. So just 2 days ago, I put up a little landscape I found in Rust at the edge of a jetty, and it's been claimed in many ways. The Isle of Rasay, Krakatoa, Colorado Mountains. I mean, people have been there, and it's lovely. They send me little notes about having been there. I think a bit definitively claimed now by the Isle of Mull, because
yes, I saw that.
You see that Andy McGregor's photograph. It's line for line.
It's remarkable.
Range. It's a bit of a dead ringer. I've only had one of those before, but I think the claiming of it sort of demonstrates really that we walk into those scenes, and that's very different from a photograph of a landscape. So when someone takes a photograph of a landscape, you admire it, but you have a very powerful sense of not being there. It's quite a distance between that coastline they're showing you and where you are. And there's something about these not being landscapes so maybe it's the way that people look at them, because they appear to be a landscape and not. They're there and they're not there. Some other conjuring goes on in the receiver. As we look at them, we make a different sense of them somehow. And so suddenly people are saying, yeah, that's mine. It's lovely.
Well, I like them because I know they're not real. Mm. I like that. I like the fact this is a fantasy world you found.
Yeah.
I don't think I would try to map it onto reality, although I did really like that Isle of Mull, just because of how close it was. I mean, that's uncanny, so that's impressive in a different way.
Yeah.
Well, I do enjoy the idea that these are alien worlds.
A lot of them have the look of, I think, backdrops to fantasy and sci-fi and gaming.
Yeah.
There's a lot of the feel of that, or backdrops for an animated movie or a stage set. I often think of them as a stage set. I could imagine an opera, particularly, that would be fantastic on a set like that. And what's also strange is I don't think people quite realize how small they are. Some of them would be only maybe 7 inches wide, and yet you feel as if you're looking out onto an ocean or several mountain ranges. So what a strange little phenomena they are.
Have you ever been tempted? I don't know if you'd admit it anyway, but have you ever been tempted to, if you see one and it's almost perfect, have you been tempted to just, kick a bit of moss out of the way? Or
no, no, I kick cigarette packets out of the way and crisp packets. No, but it just means you have to crop it a different way, or sometimes you can't use it. So no, I don't mess with them. And some of the most lovely ones, I think, the ones that I think are more like a perfect poem, are very simple, because there's just a line and a blob, and that's perhaps a horizon and a moon, and it's all you need. And it just because of the color of the stone or the texture of the stone, it really looks like something. But the blobs are often gum has been stuck onto the wall, or something has been spilled. They're very unglamorous, and sometimes the rubbish makes it in a strange way. As long as I give a nudge to look at it in a different way, then it's there. It's interesting that in the book, in the Sea Pictures book, I could use some of the ones that are not quite as discernible as others, because in the context of the book, you develop a way of looking that you accept it. As soon as it's mentioned, it's the sky. Of course it is. The ones that I might put on Twitter just on their own, they perhaps need to be more clearly, or they get lost. So having the book was great. I could embed more stuff in it.
Yeah. So you had all these images ready for the book.
Yeah.
And of course, we'll have to talk about the text as well, which is cut up text.
Yeah.
But first of all, how did you get all the photos together as a suite? Did you see some fundamental connection between them, apart from the fact they all have this sea-like or coastal quality?
Yeah, they were just the sea-like ones, or skies that you might see at the coast, and so they were in a folder. I knew I would do something with them. I had started to log the sea ones.
So you have lots of different folders then, of hills and skies. Yeah.
Yeah, because there's thousands of them now. I have to find some way to find them. So they were also catalogued for what town or city I was in. So sometimes I can remember something that I think I maybe want to use, and it was in Edinburgh, so I can go to the folder and begin to track it down. I'm not very good at filing, so it is, I have multiple files. My filing system doesn't make any sense, but it helps compared with going into a whole lot of every photo I've taken. So I did have a little folder of sea-type images that I thought I would do something with. And I hadn't made this connection at the start, but I also got the idea for cutting up Coleridge and Melville from a cut-up group on Twitter at the time that was run by Sean Fraser, called Verse Type. I don't know if you ever spotted it. It was quite a small group. So Sean's offer was that he would every month offer 2 classic poems and invite us to cut them up and make new work. And it was a fantastic challenge. I loved it. I did it for about 2 years every month, because he often chose quite romantic, archaic poems, and it wasn't a language that I would have chosen as a cut-up. I wouldn't have chosen that word bank. Everything I did utterly surprised me, which is a lovely feeling, And there were 6 to 10 people each month. So you got used to them and you got used to their work, and it was staggering what they did with the same word bank that you had, and looking at each other's work. It was fantastic. So towards the end of the year before last, now we're in February, he gave us a section of the Ancient Mariner, section 3, and a footnote, the albatross footnote from Moby Dick. And I so enjoyed that one more than any other. Those books they work so well together, or just the language of the two works so well together. I think I spoke to you about this before, but the similarities between them, which are kind of obvious, the sea-soaked worlds that they're in, and that you're being told this old man is telling you a story and leading you through a story, and they have an eerie quality, both of them, but that the energy of the writing is different, it seems to me. And Moby Dick tugs you forward into the future, and it doesn't matter how often you're stopped for a long digression about whale blubber or the layout of the furnace room. You're on a speedboat really towards this fate. It's you're never not being propelled along. And the opposite really is that the Rime of the Ancient Mariner is dragging you back in time to try to make sense of and understand a past. So they have that different energy, which is becomes strangely apparent when you keep glancing from one to the other. And the same, interestingly, on a vertical axis too, because Moby Dick pulls you under. It's going to the hell beneath, really. The Mariner has you looking at the sky. It's a kind of sky scanner. So you're looking at the sky and also to heavens above the sky. So they have these different directions that they point in, and I think there's something about that makes it really whizzy to work with the two of them together.
Yeah, that tension.
Yeah.
So you had these cut-ups then, and a folder full of seascapes.
Yeah.
And I guess then came the fun part, because you got to stick them together.
Yeah, what I did actually, the cut-up I did had already done with Sean was an interesting one, but I didn't use it. So what I did was actually lay out the pictures, because what I needed was a sequence for those pictures. There's no story, but there did need to be a sequence. We needed to move through this book. So I did that and had the 3 sections, and then I just went back to Moby Dick, which I'd read not so long ago and had done a lot of underlining because of the experience of the cut-up. I started to underline loads. It was already underlined, and I know a lot. I know the Mariner really well. So then I just made a kind of catalogue of loads of phrases and words and images, and started to do it. So yeah, they were laid out. I've got a long kind of decorator's table where I lay out art stuff I'm working on. So I had them all laid out, and then tiny scraps of paper, little tiny torn bits, like torn bus tickets that had a few words on them, like mystic call. And I'd be looking at these pictures thinking, oh yeah, where does that belong? To find a home for them all. And because the pictures were all different sizes, because of the different size of and shape of the fragments, I thought there was also, that gave a lot of freedom to have lines of different lengths. So I thought I could make it orderly by having 2 lines of text, but very free in terms of how long those lines needed to be, because the pictures were so different. I thought that it didn't look like a neat kind of package.
In a way, then, it becomes a constraint-based work.
Yeah. Yes.
And are constraints something you often look at?
Yeah. Even when Sean was offering those cut-up activities, I would always add myself another constraint. Like this month, I'm going to make it rhyme, or I'm going to write it in American haiku, or something. I like constraints. So apart from cut-up, I really like a limited alphabet. I like being able to choose words and cut up words, but I also like having to find words. And that goes back as well to a childhood thing. My mother's mom, my grandmother, she had multiple sclerosis. So she spent years of her life in bed. And she invented things that would really occupy and engage her. And one of the things she did was to choose a good long word and make words out of it. So, I'm happy to take a title, or to be given a title, and then make poems from it. And I have been told there are apps that will do this for you. And I think, well, what's the point of that? So I don't know what you do, Anthony. Not really. So again, it's the I thing. So I'll look at those letters until words begin to bounce their way out. And if I can't see them, I never find them really.
Yeah, I was going to say that finding the images in stones is very much constraint based, especially since you, as you say, you won't kick some moss away. You've got the stone, and you've got to work with what you have.
Yeah, and it's I think if I weren't doing, I wouldn't be making art or poetry if I just was, blank sheet of paper. There's nothing I really would want to say. I discover things that are interesting and curious to say and to think about and to explore through generating them out of a given bank of things.
Yeah, it's nice not to have to rely on inspiration, I think.
Yes, but actually it's a different kind of inspiration that happens through a puzzle and through curiosity. And so I think that's the work that I respond to as well, not just the work I make, is that somebody who's kind of set themselves a little puzzle here because they're not quite resolved. And I think that cut-up work in poetry, it never quite reads like a poem that someone would have written themselves. There's always some slight oddness. You can tell a cut-up poem. It sounds right and it looks right, but just different. A bit like when you might be looking at, say, scholarly papers and you recognize one that you think this just is not somebody who English was their first natural language, and their phrasing is very different, and it's really lovely. It kind of it changes the way that you hear an ordinary sentence. There's something about maybe one word is placed slightly differently, or I don't know what it is. It's hard to. There's nothing that's wrong. There's nothing you would correct, but it's not quite as you would expect it to be said or as you'd expect it to be written. And I love that, and that happens all the time with constraints. There's no other way to write it.
Yeah, I think ironically with the stricter constraints, you're trying to avoid that.
Yes.
But because it's going to happen anyway, so you have to try to avoid it.
Yeah.
And yet you kind of still want a bit to get in, so that it has that weird quality.
Yeah. The weirdest, I think, and I can't do them, that you do are palindromes. That seems to me a very, very tight constraint, and it always has that lovely quality of oddness. And I think what that does is quite liberating in a way, because it says, oh, here's a way you can still do a thing, and it looks and sounds really cool. It just extends the use of language. So I would say that having a constraint actually, for me, is a very loosening thing.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I think most constraint-based poets would say this, and people who don't do it would look confused. It's true. You need the shackles to in a way liberate you.
Yes, but of course not if you're writing your own experience. And particularly if you were writing your own experience from a position of not feeling completely free in how you can use language, then the last thing you want is to make yourself another constraint. I can understand that. And I can understand people's resistance and kind of objection to constraints. It would seem perhaps a colder or cerebral thing to do from that perspective.
Yeah. Well, what sorts of poetry do you like to read now? Do you read the kind of poetry you write, or do you read a lot of, for example, lyrical expressionist poetry, or do you like to read constraint-based?
I like constraint-based, but I also, I love all kinds of, I'm really open to all kinds of poetry, I guess. So some of my favorite poets wouldn't be writing with constraints at all, no, but I think what they write is quite fabulous, and I can almost feel a bit shaky if they write a new book and I think, what is in here? There are different kinds of reading, I guess, rather like you would choose if you're going to read some poetry, or if you're going to read a novel or a non-fiction book or what. It's the same kind of choice, isn't it? Poetry has those choices within it too. But I guess that the more lyrical poetry I can find very moving and wonderful and be a little bit in awe of it, but it wouldn't make me pick up a pen. And I'd say that the constraint-based poetry is fantastic and exciting, and I get curious and I start messing with stuff. So it's generative in the sense of my own work. And that would be true too of the difference between, say, collage art and a classic landscape art, whether that were photography or painting, is that if I see collage work, I'm often suddenly go back to something I'm doing, or have an idea, or just think, what if I put something on top of, that sense that, yes, there's something that can be worked on here. So the work having been puzzled over itself, it maybe presents you with a new puzzle or makes you curious in some way about what might be possible. Whereas the more lyrical poetry, I look at with a big wow, and afterwards feel a bit kind of shaken by it and close the book, go and make a cup of tea. It's like it doesn't. I can't kind of touch that, if you see what I mean. So a completely different experience.
I mean, you could use it as a basis for a cut up, I suppose, would be the only.
What a suggestion. No, I don't. I wouldn't cut up my favourite poets. And yet, if somebody's writing in a more experimental way, I will.
We should talk a bit more about Twitter.
Yeah.
Because this is, I think, for both of us, it's been quite an important thing for our poetry.
It's fantastic. It's an amazing place, I think. And, the connections and collaborations that have been possible through Twitter are unimaginable. It's really changed my life in a way.
I would say the same.
Yeah.
Being able to share poetry all over the world, whenever I feel like it, is quite amazing, and it's led to a lot of opportunities.
Yeah.
And it's not as bad as people say, I think. It's not. I don't see too much negativity there. I suppose if you don't look for it, you can avoid it.
There's something about having a sense of why you want to use it.
Yeah.
And like knowing what you're there for, because it does draw you. Political Twitter especially does kind of draw you, because of course you have a response to things and to things that are being said, but there's just that decision of whether that's what you're going to use Twitter for or not, and then to curate your page accordingly. But it's the only social media platform I've ever used, and people used to show me Facebook a lot, and I would say, show it to me, and like, show me what it is, and I would see it and think, I don't know what I would do here, really. Like, I wouldn't know my own place. And then someone showed me Twitter who had a professional account. So they used it for their own profession, stuff they were interested in. But I could see loads of signposting and sharing of interesting things. And I thought, that could be really useful. And I remember asking him, are there any poets on there? And he looked at me a bit blankly and said, well, name a poet. And I thought, who might be on Twitter? Who's kind of a connected person who maybe writes quite a lot? And so I suggested George Surtees, and there he was, writing his poetry, verse by verse at the time, and also quoting, he was retweeting another poet's work as well. And I thought, okay, I'm up for this. Yeah, it's just curating your page. I think if there's anything nasty or problematic or hateful, just like opt out. It's easy to opt out. I have no problem offending people by going away.
It's curious to me. I mean, you mentioned George Surtees, who does post a lot of poetry there. Mm-hmm. But it's quite curious that there are a lot of poets on Twitter and they don't post anything.
No.
And I'm not quite sure why that is.
Well, I guess what we put on Twitter is often just work in progress. There's a freedom about it because it gets buried. An hour later it will be buried in the timeline. No one else will see it. So I've always talked about Twitter as being sticking something on a lamppost, which is something I always liked to do, actually, in the early days when we had only little paper zines and things that we wrote, only going to have a circulation of 10 anyway. So I used to pin stuff up on a wall or on a lamppost, and 2 days later it would all be torn away. Or sometimes you thought maybe someone took it. How lovely. But that was the illusion. But I quite like you put stuff up and it's blown away. So maybe it's too much. It's not a sturdy enough or lasting platform for people, or it's giving something away that perhaps they are holding back for a collection or to publish in a different form. It's like showing somebody a rehearsal or an attempt, that kind of thing. And I think that's fantastic. There's a lovely freedom to it, and everyone does that, and it all piles up every day, and the next day you can't find a thing if you went to look for it, you wouldn't be able to find it. So the transience of it appeals to me, and I think it's great. Then we'll all do a different thing tomorrow. But I think the kind of holding and curation of your own stuff until it's ready to be formally published is just a different. So maybe they're on Twitter to see stuff, to be a listener or a viewer rather than to contribute, or for other things, just for events, to publicize events or publications, which is fair enough.
Absolutely. Because there were a lot of journals that would say we won't accept your work if it's been on Twitter. But I think that is changing now. I'm seeing more and more saying that, it doesn't matter.
No, it really doesn't. I never understood that.
It's got to be good for poetry, hasn't it, to share it freely?
I would think so, yes. But you do get comments, and so I think that might be difficult for people to get. They would be happy to show it, but wouldn't want the comments that come back. I get great advice from people.
Always appreciated, isn't it?
Always
people telling you what they would have done differently.
Always delighted. Yeah, I mean, there are people who will rewrite. I've seen people rewriting other people's poems.
Yeah.
Might it be better if you put dawn before pink rather than pink before dawn? And I think that's quite a thing to do. And I do love it that I get people who have mistaken my images for a painting and write to me saying, I wonder if you used a different panel size or put the horizon lower down the panel. And I think, oh, lovely.
What artist doesn't love unsolicited advice?
So there might be something of that. There's, showing your work in progress, you get comments on it. But it's a communal space, and the value of it, I think, is a terrific self-publishing space for people too. You can be known for a series of very small tweets, and that's kind of lovely. That's an unprecedented opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, and I made lots of contacts by posting poems, not just from being there.
Yeah.
I couldn't have just started the Twitter account and said, "Hey, everybody, I'm a poet," and then expected to make friends.
You're very generous with your poems. They, you really give us at least a poem a day, as far as I can tell, because we kind of watch out for it. Yeah, and it's fantastic. It's a thing that you go to, your page, destination.
Oh,
I think is the word.
I mean, why do you think poetry is so unpopular?
I don't think it is unpopular. I really don't. I've heard the conversations about it. I think there is more poetry and more interest in poetry than there has been for a long time. I know, for example, that kids are introduced to a wider range of poetry more early in school than has happened in the past. And that's in spite of the horrible constriction of education and the minimalisation of arts. I think it's happened because poetry is quick.
Yeah.
You can fit it into a lesson shorter to discuss a poem than to find space for, the kids to all read the same novel and so on.
Which is why it also works on Twitter.
Yes.
I mean, I definitely accept the argument that there's a chance poetry is being read more than it ever has been. I don't know if it's selling as well as it ever has. Maybe that's what I'm worried about.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, no, maybe it doesn't sell. And there's a kind of there are limits, I think, to what publishers would take on, which is why really small presses now are vital. But there's in one of the museums of modern art in Edinburgh, they've got a fantastic library and archive, which includes a lot of surrealist poets, and they've got their original zines and postcards and things they made for their exhibition. And over the years, I've always gone and looked at those little exhibitions, and I've realised that this very small group of people made all this stuff primarily between themselves, these tiny handmade booklets and things. So I think that unusual poetry or constrained poetry, surrealist stuff, anything very experimental has always moved in quite small circles. So I don't think I think that's less now than it used to be, because we can find each other on places like Twitter. There are more places to kind of find the tribe you belong to, I think, really.
Well, you still have these very small, these micro presses producing poetry in editions of 20, sometimes 20, sometimes 30.
Yeah.
And and okay that, there aren't lots of copies of them in the world, but they're really nice things to have.
Yes.
And I wouldn't want to live in a world where that wasn't going on.
No. And I really like making things that are just one-off. I'm not that bothered about reach or numbers. I don't like the quantitative measurement of success. I mean, I know if you're running a press, you've got to cover your costs and make some money out of it. But I don't like the way that everything is measured in sales figures and numbers and money. I think that I've always made artist books, for example, and they're just like they're for one person. And I think if one person really understands and enjoys the work you've done, then you're done. Like, that's it. That was what it was for.
Yeah, and I have one of your books.
Oh, you have
made
that?
for us.
Yeah.
And it is beautiful, and I treasure it. What other ways do you go about promoting your work other than Twitter? You said you don't really like readings.
I don't think I'm a good reader, and for the work that I've been doing, which is quite visual, it would have to be I don't know quite how to put the words with the images. So when I did the reading for you, I made a movie. A bit of a tiny,
good way around it.
Yeah, where the words would type themselves on the screen. But that was just not knowing quite how to get the reading and the images to work together, and for one not to overcome the other. So no, I just have no big deal at all about my work being seen, as long as some people have it or see it. And at times in my life, I've exhibited artwork, and it's very interesting the route that it takes you down. So you'd have maybe given a wall in a gallery, and you submit your, say, 10 pictures, and let's say half of them sell when you're there for the preview, and that feels great. That's a good outcome. And so the gallerist would say, we're having another group show in the spring, so if perhaps you could have a bigger space. So you think, oh, okay, and that feels very successful. And so you send them the JPEGs of your next lot, and then they write back and say, well, have you got any more like the ones that were sold? And then you sort of realize, of course, this is a shop. And there's a market there, and they're watching what do people buy, and so you do less experimenting and more repeating of the things that people are enjoying and that people like. And then someone at the next show will drag you over to one of your more experimental bits and will say, I love this. You have this moment of joy, and then they say, do you have something with more pink in it like this? And I almost, when they ask those questions, I don't even understand the question for a minute. It's like, pink? And yes, I've redecorated my conservatory, and something like this in pink would be so perfect. And so there's that sense like, I'm being pulled into a tighter path here, and less creativity, less room for curiosity, less play.
It's interesting in general how much you should, as an artist of any kind, how much attention you should pay to what your audience wants.
Yeah, because, well, I suppose I'm saying I pay virtually none.
Yeah, I think that seems to be the best way to be an artist, but
it doesn't work in the commercial world, which is about what is selling and selling more of what sells, and so it's difficult, I think, to do that. That's why the more experimental presses are so wonderful, in that they are always looking for something a little bit different, and not wanting to repeat themselves, or for you to have, send them the same thing twice. And that's great. That's very new, and that's why I think I say these are good times, and I can't connect with the demise of poetry. It seems to me it's really kicking.
That's good. It's nice to have a positive comment. But towards the end, because I think we are at the end. What are you working on now?
I do have this might be the last collection of landscapes because I'm maybe moving on to something else. But I do have a collection of landscapes that I'm putting together now. So at the moment, I'm in that same position as I was with sea pictures of finding some kind of sequence for them to be in. And so I don't know if this will work, but I mean, I'll tell you about it because this is an interesting experiment for me in how to work with the text. So you could, I don't know how I'd describe it, maybe crowdsourced might be the closest I could say. So I've shown these pictures to different people at different times, and I've noticed what they've said. And so I have that language, and I'm going to try to write using things, words and phrases that people have used when they've seen them, with no prompt from me. And that includes just people I'm sitting next to on the train sometimes. Here's a little thing I'm working on, a little artwork I'm working on, and they look at it and say something about it.
That's very interesting. Again, you're going out into the world to find these things. Yeah,
I found the little landscapes out in the world, and now I'm finding the responses to the landscapes and just using that as my word bank or bank of phrases I can draw on. Some of which it's amazing what people say when you just show them it and say, well, does it, do you have any response to it, or does it remind you of anything, or how would you describe it? And off they go.
They don't start correcting it.
No, it's a bit like Twitter in that I do get a lot of responses of people saying what they see or what it makes them think of, or a memory attached to it or something. It's lovely. It's very touching, really, what people send sometimes, or what they make of it, which isn't what you expected. How they see it, or they write almost a tiny story of their own or poem of their own sometimes in relation to the image that I posted, which is amazing. So I have got a lot of material that I could cut up and see if I could make some kind of thing happen. I don't know if it will work, but that's what I'm working on.
And it's an experiment, isn't it? If it doesn't work, there'll be another experiment.
Of course, it will turn into something. It's only by playing with it that it will turn into something eventually.
Mary, thank you very much for your time, and it was great to talk to you again.
It's a pleasure, an honour too. Thank you.
To discover more, visit us at penteractpress.com.